There's a moment in just about every Western movie. The outlaw rattles his chains, flashes a cocky smile, and just slips away into legend. Hollywood wants you to picture Billy the Kid as the clean-cut escape artist, all cleverness and swagger. But if you'd been standing outside the Lincoln County Courthouse on the 28th of April, 1881, what you'd have witnessed would have been a mess about as far from a movie heist as you can get. You wouldn't see anything clever or tidy. What would have hit you first was probably the smell. Blood, sweat so thick it clung to the air, and grime ground into every layer of clothing. Rusted iron shackles ground into raw, filthy wrists, leaving skin chewed up and red. Billy's shirt was soaked through, sticky with sweat and dirt, probably stiff from old blood. And just to finish the greeting, gunshots echoing through the building, a desperate outlaw dragging himself half free, half wounded across splintered wood and sun-baked stone. We remember Billy the Kid as the West's ultimate escape artist. He's a myth wrapped around a man, the boy bandit who danced through danger, dodged every lawman, and supposedly put a bullet in a man for every year of his short life. But the real legend? It's less about trick shots and more about what that jailbreak did to his body. The blood, the pain, and the reality that this freedom might just have been the start of a new, slower execution. Because in 1881, if the law didn't kill you, infection or plain exhaustion was waiting to finish the job. So let's set the stage. Billy, real name probably Henry McCarty, but by then calling himself William Bonney, or just the Kid, had already outlasted most of his friends. By this point, he'd survived shootouts, double crosses, and the Lincoln County War, but the law finally caught him. He was only 21, convicted of murder, chained up in a second-story cell in the stifling, run-down courthouse at Lincoln, New Mexico. Nothing glamorous about this jail. The place stank. Sweat, rotten food, and whatever passed for a toilet in 1881. He was locked up in heavy irons, thick cuffs, brutal chains. No Hollywood tricks here. The hardware was made to break your spirit as much as your skin. Billy waited. Every passing hour, the pain got worse. Shackles like these don't just keep you put, they grind your wrists raw with every twitch, until the iron bites deeper, the skin cracks, and blood mixes with sweat and filth. That's an open invitation to infection, a slow, feverish death, unless you get out fast or someone gets sorry. And in Lincoln County, mercy wasn't on the menu. On the night of his now legendary escape, Billy was guarded by two deputies, James Bell and Bob Olinger. Sheriff Pat Garrett, the very man who'd chased Billy into legend, was out of town, leaving the job to his less careful underlings. Most people know the legend, but the real story is a lot more about torn skin and pain than it is about smooth moves and lucky gunplay. Billy's first and worst problem wasn't the deputies, it was his own body. Before he could go anywhere, he had to beat the pain, swelling, and the awkward shuffle of rusted chain. Picture trying to move with bruised skin already splitting open under the iron. Every step risked, tearing it more, making him slower, weaker, and easier to grab. One wrong move, a stumble, a botched grip, and the plan would end in a clatter of chains and blood on the dirty stone floor. And even if he did make it out, the trail would be obvious and red. His chance came on a typical, miserable afternoon. Deputy Bell brought him down the courthouse stairs, Billy in irons, shuffling, Bell right behind, sweat and nerves thick in the air. Bell was tense, Billy was desperate. Then, in a sudden blur, Billy struck. Sources argue about the exact move, but it was quick, up close, and violent. Bell staggered, a shot rang out, and Billy clambered past, still tangled in chains. Now the pain wasn't just background noise. Every step was sandpaper in a wound. He scrambled up, iron scraping bone, adrenaline sharp as nails. Easy to forget. The fight could have killed him before the law ever got a chance. Billy wasn't some Hollywood gymnast. He was a 21-year-old, bruised, hungry, dehydrated, and bleeding. Bell, mortally wounded, staggered out a side door and collapsed in the dirt. Billy hobbled for his next shot, Bob Olinger's loaded shotgun, which, for reasons history students still laugh about, was just lying around. Not exactly law enforcement's finest moment. Olinger heard the chaos and ran straight into his own gun, held by the prisoner he'd mocked. Some versions have Billy calling out, "Hello, Bob," before firing. Whether he said it or not, Olinger was dead before he hit the ground. The gunfire was more than loud. It was like setting off a fire bell in a town already anxious for drama. Doors slammed shut. Windows flew open. Billy now had maybe a minute, tops. There's that famous image. Billy the Kid on the courthouse balcony, still shackled, blood running down his wrists, every eye in town locked on him. This is the heart of the legend, the world's most wanted outlaw, suddenly free and in full view. But what's always left out? He was battered, favoring his wrists, limping from the weight and pain of the chains. The shackles, now wrecked, weren't just a way to keep him in, they were evidence, leaving smears of blood across stone and wood, a trail any half-awake deputy could follow. Some accounts say Billy managed to break or pick his chains using whatever tools were lying around, maybe an iron bar, a nail, even a splintered piece of wood. However he did it, it wasn't quiet, it wasn't clean, and it definitely wasn't painless. Hammering at iron with blood-slick hands, every blow sent a jolt up already bruised arm. Every second spent wrestling those chains was another chance for the law, or a bystander with a rifle to end the whole thing right there. By the time he ditched the irons, his wrists and ankles were probably swollen, bleeding, and ground raw through his clothes and boots. There's a dark sort of comedy in the scene if you look for it. The famous killer, standing in broad daylight, struggling not with some steel safe, but with the problem of getting his own skin out from under rusted iron. Think less, Mission Impossible. More very bloody three-legged race with your life at stake. When he finally broke free, or at least got the irons loose enough, Billy bolted for the stables. He had to know he was on display, a living warning to every would-be outlaw and, let's be honest, an embarrassment to the men who were supposed to be watching him. People crowded in doorways and windows, some frozen, some slack-jawed. The Kid, hands bloodied, shirt torn and sticky, clambered onto a stolen horse. Chains clattered on the ground. The crowd parted, some ducked, a few even cheered, though the lawmen weren't about to admit it. But Billy wasn't riding into any sunset. He was leaving town on a borrowed horse, hands shaking, clothes stained, his body already failing him. The minute the adrenaline wore off, the consequences set in. Torn skin, ruined wrists, bones aching, exhaustion so deep your vision swims. If someone had seen him after, he wouldn't have looked like a legend. He'd have looked like he'd just been dragged behind a wagon. That freedom was paid for in agony, not triumph. By the halfway point, Billy's escape was less about outsmarting the law and more about surviving his own wounds. The town was in chaos. 2 deputies dead, and the most famous outlaw in America was now just a bleeding, Battered young man alone on the open plains, already wondering if infection or fever would finish him off before Garrett even got a shot. This is the part Hollywood skips. Billy's escape didn't make him free. It made him a fugitive, and his own body was now just as likely to betray him as any posse on his trail. The next miles were a brutal test of what the human body could take. He couldn't ride hard. Every jolt sent burning pain up through battered limbs. The blood didn't stop at the jail. Every hoofbeat could rip open fresh wounds, soaking cuffs and reins. Even if the chains were half broken or slipped off, the bruised, swollen skin left every move a fresh round of torture. Try holding onto a horse when your grip is slipping from blood, pain, and days without real sleep or food. Every escape comes with a price, and Billy's bill was just starting to come due. Once he was out of town, he had to find cover fast anywhere to treat his wounds. But in 1881 New Mexico, first aid meant a rag, some hope, and maybe a muddy creek. The best he could do was try to wash off the blood, tear strips from his shirt for makeshift bandages, and pray the dirt hadn't already turned those wounds into a slow, invisible death sentence. We don't have any record of a doctor seeing Billy after the escape. But everything we know about chain wounds, 19th century hygiene, and Western jails says the odds weren't good. Tetanus, gangrene, blood poisoning back then, even a scratched finger could kill you. Billy now had wounds that could have ended him before Garrett ever caught up. It gets worse. The wounds dictated everything. How far he could ride, how long he could hide, even whether he could draw his pistol with any force. Laying low, he'd need to sleep with his wrists up or risk the swelling, making his hands useless by morning. The pain and exhaustion blurred his judgment a brutal reality, not something that fits into a neat Hollywood montage. His legendary quick draw, his agility, all of it now limited by the damage left behind by iron and blood. And here's the cruelest twist. Billy survived the deputies, the law, the panic in town, only to end up stalked by the consequences of his own escape. No movie ever shows the outlaw shivering with fever, struggling to control a horse with hands that barely work, or lying awake at night, more terrified of the pain creeping up his arm than of any lawman. That's the real price of the Lincoln County Jailbreak. Freedom bought with pieces of flesh left on the courthouse floor, and every day after stalked by the threat of infection, collapse, or just plain being too weak to keep running. But somehow, Billy managed it for a few weeks. Anyway, he rode, he hid, he ate what he could steal, and he kept moving until Pat Garrett finally caught up, just as his wounds were starting to scar. There's no heroics here, just a young man's body stretched to the absolute limits by violence, bad luck, and the inescapable laws of biology. The myth says Billy the Kid rode off into legend. The truth, he limped, bled, and barely beat death by infection long enough for a bullet to end it. So the next time you see the Hollywood version, chains flying, guns blazing, the clean getaway, remember this. Billy's real escape was a slow-motion disaster, written in bruises, blood, and the ever-present stink of infection. That he survived even a handful of days is less about outlaw genius and more about plain, stubborn will, the drive to survive a body that wanted to quit at every turn. That's the real story of Billy the Kid's jailbreak. Not a victory lap, but a desperate, bloody crawl toward a freedom that could never last. If you want more outlaw history, warts, wounds, and all the ugly details Hollywood leaves out, make sure you're subscribed. There's plenty more where this came from, And if you stuck through to the end of this story, congratulations. You've probably earned your own set of metaphorical scars.